The mail-order bride was warned the cowboy was deadly. His answer shocked everyone. The planet was a patchwork of ochre deserts, green valleys, and jagged mountains that seemed almost alive in the golden light of the twin suns. She had seen pictures, but nothing could prepare her for the sense of isolation that washed over her when she imagined herself walking alone on those distant plains. She tightened her grip on the small, worn suitcase she carried. Inside were all the essentials: a few dresses, a journal, and her most precious belongings. She had made the decision months ago to leave Earth behind and become a mail-order bride to a man she had never met. Her family had been skeptical, her friends had been hesitant, and yet here she was, hurtling through space toward a man who had a reputation that both intrigued and terrified the entire frontier. Jonah Creed. Even his name seemed like it belonged in a legend. People spoke of him in hushed tones. He was a cowboy, a lone settler who had made a home on the harsh frontier of Caldera 9, and people said he was deadly. Ilara had heard the warnings more times than she could count. The colonial office had sent her a thick packet filled with notes and official warnings. He has a dangerous reputation. Exercise extreme caution. The settlers she had met during her preparations had been even more direct. "Don't go there thinking it's all romance and charm," one woman had said, a sharp line cutting across her tired face. "He's the kind of man who gets his way. Deadly, some say, and no one knows why." Ilara had smiled politely at the warnings, nodding to show she appreciated the advice. But deep down, curiosity had carried her forward. The warnings only made her want to meet him more. She wanted to understand why this man was considered so dangerous, especially when the records she could access showed no proof of violence. There were stories, rumors, whispers, but nothing concrete. As the shuttle descended toward the surface, Ilara felt a strange mixture of fear and excitement. The frontier was harsh. The settlements were few and far between, connected only by dirt roads, hover wagons, and the occasional signal beacon. And here she was, landing in the middle of a world that was as unpredictable as it was beautiful. The shuttle landed on a small landing pad outside what looked like a modest homestead. The house was sturdy, built of weathered metal and reinforced wood. A few solar panels shimmered in the sunlight, and a small garden of vegetables and hardy plants surrounded the home. Smoke rose lazily from a chimney, curling into the crisp, dry air. Ilara's heart beat faster as she stepped off the shuttle. She adjusted her dress and took a deep breath. This was it, the moment she would meet Jonah Creed. She was not greeted immediately by a man. Instead, a large, friendly dog bounded toward her, barking and wagging its tail. Ilara laughed, kneeling to stroke the animal's rough fur. It was the kind of warm, honest welcome she hadn't expected. Then, from the porch, a man appeared. Jonah Creed. He was taller than she had imagined, with broad shoulders and a calm, steady presence. His hair was dark and tied back loosely, and his face was lined not from age but from the sun and wind, proof of years spent on the frontier. His eyes were sharp, intelligent, and strangely kind. "Miss Vance?" he asked, his voice low but steady. "Yes," Ilara replied, standing and curtsying lightly, though the gesture felt awkward in the wide-open spaces of Caldera 9. "I'm Jonah. Welcome to Caldera 9. Ilara nodded, feeling a flicker of relief. He did not seem deadly. At least not in the way the warnings had made her fear. Jonah smiled faintly. "I've heard a lot about you." "Only good things, I hope," Ilara said, her voice bright, though she could feel her heart still racing. "You've heard warnings, I imagine," Jonah said. "That's what most people do. They hear the rumors first, long before they see the truth." Ilara raised her eyebrows. "Rumors?" Jonah nodded, gesturing for her to follow him inside. "That's right. Some call me deadly, others call me strange, most simply keep their distance. But the reality is, I don't see myself that way. People fear what they don't understand." Ilara paused, considering his words. She felt a spark of admiration for the man. He did not deny the rumors, nor did he seem offended. Instead, he seemed to understand how people viewed him, and to have made peace with it. Inside the house, the air was warm and smelled faintly of herbs and wood smoke. The rooms were simple but comfortable. A few pieces of furniture were crafted from local timber, and the walls were decorated with paintings of Caldera Nine's landscapes. It was a home that had been built with care and respect for the land, not for show or grandeur. Ilara looked around and then back at Jonah. "You're very different from what people expected," she said softly. He chuckled. "I get that a lot, but I've learned that the frontier doesn't care for exaggeration or showmanship. It cares for skill, patience, and respect." Ilara nodded slowly, feeling a strange sense of calm. Perhaps this was why people found him so unsettling. Jonah's strength was quiet, not loud. His power came not from force but from his ability to survive, adapt, and influence others without ever raising a hand. Over the next hour, Jonah showed her the homestead. The garden was flourishing with vegetables, the small greenhouse was filled with seedlings, and a series of irrigation channels fed the plants with careful precision. Machines hummed softly, but none were overpowering or aggressive. Everything seemed to work in harmony, as if the land and the human who tended it were partners rather than masters and subjects. Ilara could not help but ask, "How do you manage all of this alone?" Jonah smiled faintly. "I don't, not really. I've learned to listen to the land, to the weather, to the animals. They tell me what to do if I pay attention. Most people want to fight the frontier. I've learned that to survive here, you need to work with it." Ilara considered his words carefully. There was wisdom in them, a kind of intelligence that could not be measured by force or authority. Perhaps this was why people called him deadly. Not because he could hurt someone, but because he represented a kind of human potential that was unsettling in its clarity. By the time the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the desert, Ilara felt a sense of awe and curiosity she had not expected. She had come to Caldera Nine fearing a dangerous man, only to find someone who was quietly extraordinary. Someone whose presence alone seemed to challenge the assumptions and fears of the frontier settlements. That night, as they sat on the porch watching the twin suns dip below the horizon, Jonah spoke again. "Most people think the frontier is about survival," he said. "But survival is only the first step. To truly thrive, you have to understand the world around you and yourself. Most fear what they don't understand, and so they call it deadly. But often, the truth is much simpler. It's just human potential they can't control." Ilara listened, her heart swelling with a mixture of excitement and reassurance. She had crossed the stars to meet a man she had never known, drawn by rumors and warnings. And now she understood. The danger wasn't in Jonah Creed himself. The danger, if any, was in realizing how much humans could do when they refused to be limited by fear, rumor, or expectation. As night fell over Caldera Nine, the stars shone brighter than they had anywhere on Earth. Ilara felt a deep sense of anticipation. This was only the beginning. She did not yet know what adventures awaited, what mysteries she would uncover, or what changes she might inspire. But she knew one thing clearly. She had arrived on the frontier not to be protected, but to witness a man whose life challenged the very definition of what it meant to be human. And in that moment, under the endless sky of Caldera Nine, Ilara Vance knew she had made the right choice. The morning sun rose over the golden plains of Caldera Nine, painting the land with soft light. Ilara awoke in the small guest room Jonah had prepared for her. The window framed the vast expanse of desert stretching endlessly toward the horizon. She could see a few distant ridges and the faint glimmer of a stream cutting through the sand. The planet's beauty was unlike anything she had imagined, but it was also unforgiving. Survival here required patience, intelligence, and a quiet strength, the kind that Jonah seemed to possess in abundance. Ilara dressed quickly, eager to see more of Jonah's world. She stepped outside and the morning air was crisp and carried a hint of wild herbs. Jonah was already up, tending to the garden. He moved with care, adjusting the irrigation lines and checking the seedlings as if the plants themselves could speak and he could understand them. "Good morning," she called softly. Jonah looked up and smiled. "Morning, sleep well." "Yes," Alara replied. "The room is perfect." She paused. "And the planet, it's incredible," Jonah chuckled. "It can be beautiful and unforgiving at the same time. You have to respect both sides." Alara nodded. She had heard settlers talk about the danger of Caldera 9, of storms that could rise without warning, of sand that could swallow a poorly built structure, and of wildlife that was both strange and unpredictable. And yet, Jonah seemed completely at ease. Watching him move, she realized that the whispers about him being deadly might not refer to how he handled people, but how he handled the world. "Do you want to help?" Jonah asked, holding out a small basket of seedlings. Alara laughed softly. "I've never gardened in my life, but I'm willing to try." Jonah showed her how to plant the seedlings carefully, explaining how the soil here needed gentle handling. "Rushing or forcing things rarely works," he said. "Everything grows in its own time. You just have to give it space and care." As Alara worked, she thought about the warnings she had received before arriving. She had imagined Jonah as a harsh, unforgiving man, someone who would demand obedience and perhaps even strike fear into anyone who came near. But the man before her was nothing like that. His strength was not in aggression or fear, but in knowledge, patience, and the ability to work with the world rather than against it. After breakfast, Jonah led her on a tour of the homestead. The house itself was only a part of the story. There were wind turbines on the hills, solar panels lining the rooftops, and a clever system that collected water from the morning dew. Everything seemed designed to make life easier, but also to respect the fragile ecosystem of Caldera 9. Alara noticed a small pen with strange, gentle creatures that looked like a mix between goats and llamas. Jonah explained that they were native to the planet and could be trained to carry supplies or plow fields. "They're not wild," he said. "They're smart enough to work with you if you earn their trust. Force doesn't work here either." Alara smiled. "It seems like everything on this planet responds to patience and care." Jonah nodded. "Exactly. That's why people call me deadly. Most settlers expect strength to be shown in force, in weapons, in fear. But out here, the strongest person is the one who can survive without destroying everything around them." Alara thought about that for a moment. She realized that Jonah's reputation might have been misunderstood. To the people sending warnings, someone who could thrive without violence was more dangerous than any bandit or wild animal. It challenged everything they had come to believe about survival on the frontier. As they walked back toward the house, a small convoy of settlers arrived. They were here to trade supplies and, secretly, to see Jonah for themselves. The rumors of his deadliness had spread quickly across Caldera 9, and some people wanted to know if the stories were true. The settlers looked uneasy when they saw Jonah. They whispered to each other, glancing at the tidy homestead and the calm, steady man who seemed to command nothing with force. Jonah greeted them warmly and invited them to share breakfast. Alara watched as the settlers relaxed in his presence. They had arrived expecting confrontation, but Jonah offered nothing but hospitality and wisdom. He listened to their concerns, offered practical advice, and helped them with small tasks around the property. By mid-morning, Alara began to understand why Jonah was considered dangerous. Not because he could hurt anyone, but because he made people rethink their assumptions. He showed that strength didn't come from fear or domination, but from cooperation, intelligence, and respect. During a break, one of the settlers spoke privately to Alara. "He's not what we expected," she admitted. "We heard he was deadly, but he's helpful, calm. He makes you feel like you could actually survive here without fear." Alara smiled. "That's what I've been thinking too." "It's strange, isn't it? That someone can be considered dangerous for being human. The woman nodded. Exactly. Most settlers don't understand it. They think strength is shown in confrontation. Jonah shows it in everything else. It makes them uncomfortable. Later, Jonah took Alara to the edge of a cliff overlooking a vast canyon. The land fell away sharply, revealing a river winding like a silver thread through the valley below. He leaned on the railing and looked out at the horizon. "Do you see why I came here?" he asked. Alara shook her head. "I think I'm starting to. You came here not just to survive, but to show something different." Jonah smiled faintly. "Exactly. Most people don't expect humans to work together with the land, to respect its limits, to build something lasting rather than temporary. That's why I'm considered dangerous. Not to the people I meet, but to those who depend on fear and control to keep power over others." Alara nodded slowly. The words sank in. Jonah wasn't deadly to people. He was deadly to old ideas, old systems, and old ways of thinking. He was a quiet revolution in human form, a reminder that survival and strength could exist without cruelty. As the day progressed, Jonah taught Alara more about life on the frontier. He showed her how to navigate using the stars, how to identify safe plants to eat, and how to understand the subtle changes in weather that could mean life or death for settlers unprepared for the planet's harsh conditions. Alara found herself growing more confident with each lesson. She realized that part of Jonah's influence was his ability to teach others without judgment, without pressure, and without fear. He showed her that humans could adapt to anything if they approached it with intelligence, patience, and care. By evening, a gentle wind swept across the plains, carrying the scent of wildflowers and dust. Alara and Jonah sat outside, watching the twin suns set in brilliant colors that seemed almost unreal. The settlers who had arrived in the morning had left, their perceptions of Jonah forever changed. They would speak of him not as a dangerous man, but as a guide, a teacher, and someone who reminded them what humans were truly capable of. Alara turned to Jonah. "Do you ever get tired of people misunderstanding you?" He shook his head. "Not really. Most people fear what they don't understand. That's natural. I only hope they see the truth eventually. If not, it's their lesson to learn." Alara smiled, feeling a deep respect for him. She had crossed the stars expecting a dangerous man, and instead found someone who could teach her more about humanity and survival than any textbook or training program ever could. That night, as they prepared for bed, Alara reflected on the day's experiences. Jonah Creed was not what she had feared. He was far more remarkable. His strength was subtle, his influence silent, yet undeniable. He had survived and thrived where others had failed, not by domination, but by understanding and cooperation. And in that understanding, Alara realized something important. The real frontier was not just the land or the planets. It was the human potential to adapt, to respect, and to thrive. Jonah Creed embodied that potential, and she felt honored to witness it. As she drifted to sleep, she felt a mix of excitement and anticipation. Tomorrow would bring more lessons, more discoveries, and perhaps the answers to the questions that had brought her here. The frontier was vast, mysterious, and full of challenges, but with Jonah by her side, she felt ready to face whatever came next. For the first time in her life, Alara felt a true sense of belonging. Not because of a man's strength over her, but because of the quiet strength she saw reflected in him. A strength that belonged to all humans willing to learn, adapt, and respect the world around them. And as the twin moons of Caldera 9 rose in the night sky, casting a silver glow over the plains, Alara knew that this was only the beginning of her journey. The morning light on Caldera 9 was soft and golden, brushing the horizon with streaks of pink and orange. Alara woke to the sound of birds she had never seen before, their calls ringing clear across the plains. She stretched and stepped outside, breathing in the crisp air. Today, she felt a sense of purpose. She had questions that could no longer wait. Jonah was already outside inspecting the water channels that ran through the garden. He looked up and smiled at her. "Morning," he said. "Sleep well." "Yes," Alara replied, smiling back. "The moons last night were beautiful. I think I understand why this planet feels so alive." Jonah chuckled softly. Caldera 9 has a way of teaching patience. The land doesn't reveal its secrets quickly, but if you watch and listen, it shows you everything you need to know. Alara nodded. She watched him for a moment, thinking of all the settlers who had warned her about him. Deadly, dangerous, unpredictable. How could anyone consider this calm, thoughtful man a threat? As breakfast ended, Alara found herself standing near the edge of the garden, looking down at the irrigation channels. "Jonah," she said, hesitating slightly, "can I ask you something personal?" Jonah turned to her, curious but patient. "Of course." "Why are people so afraid of you?" she asked. "I've seen you today, yesterday you're kind, patient, and generous. I don't understand." Jonah paused. He leaned on the wooden railing of the porch, staring out at the plains. "It's a question most people avoid," he said slowly. "And not without reason. The answer is simple, but it makes some people uncomfortable." Alara tilted her head, urging him to continue. "I don't fight with fear or force," he said. "I survive and thrive without harming others. I teach settlers to depend on themselves, to respect the land, to think and act wisely. I don't follow rules blindly. I don't let power control me. Most people expect danger to be shown with weapons, anger, or violence. I show it with understanding, patience, and action that challenges old systems. That scares them more than any duel ever could." Alara blinked. "So, you're deadly because you make people rethink everything," Jonah nodded. "Exactly. People fear change. They fear losing control. And when they see someone succeed without cruelty or dominance, they call it dangerous. They can't see the strength behind patience and cooperation." Alara thought about that. The settlers who had visited yesterday had arrived tense and wary, ready to judge him. By the end of the day, they left impressed, even grateful. Jonah's influence had shifted them without a word of confrontation. That must have seemed impossible to those who believed only force could shape the frontier. "I think I understand," Alara said softly. "But it's still hard to believe. People hear rumors, then they assume the worst." "That's human nature," Jonah replied. "People fear what they cannot predict. They hear stories, then they create their own conclusions. And when the truth doesn't match their expectations, they get uncomfortable." Alara smiled, but there was a lingering curiosity she couldn't shake. "Can you tell me why they call you deadly specifically? I mean, what exactly have you done?" Jonah's gaze returned to the horizon. "I've never harmed anyone. Not physically, not intentionally. But I have challenged systems that were harming people, and I've done it without confrontation. I've shown settlers that they don't need to rely on corporations, enforcers, or outside authorities to survive. I've taught them independence, patience, and cooperation. That scares those who profit from dependence and fear." Alara listened carefully. She began to see the truth. The danger wasn't in Jonah himself, it was in what he represented. He was a quiet rebel, a man whose very existence challenged the old ways of thinking. "You mean, the people calling you deadly are afraid because you empower others?" she asked. Jonah nodded. "Exactly. The most dangerous thing in the universe is not a weapon or a fist. It's knowledge, self-reliance, and courage, the kind that makes people free to think for themselves. That's why they fear me. That's why they say I'm deadly." Alara felt a rush of admiration. Jonah's strength wasn't in violence or intimidation. It was in something far rarer, the ability to inspire and protect without controlling others. She had never met anyone like him before, and she realized how much she wanted to learn from him. Later that morning, Jonah took her to a small ridge overlooking the valley where several settlers had begun experimenting with independent farms. They were clearly following some of Jonah's teachings. water systems optimized for the harsh land, small greenhouses built with careful attention to light and temperature, and crops planted in patterns that maximize survival without harming the soil. These settlers are learning, Jonah explained. They've started to trust themselves. That's what I mean by being deadly. They are no longer dependent on the old systems. They're beginning to thrive on their own, and that makes those who control resources nervous. Alara looked down at the farms, watching people work with determination and care. It was inspiring. She could see the change taking place, not through force or intimidation, but through example, guidance, and human ingenuity. "Do they ever fear you?" she asked. "Some do at first," Jonah said. "Fear is natural, but fear fades when people see that what I offer is guidance, not control. They may still whisper, but it's because they're not used to seeing humans succeed without destruction or coercion. It unsettles them, but it also opens possibilities." As the day continued, Jonah introduced Alara to a few of the settlers who had begun thriving under his influence. Each conversation revealed the same truth. People respected him not for his power over them, but for his ability to teach, inspire, and protect. One man, a former corporate settler who had tried to control the land with machines and regulations, admitted to Alara, "At first, I thought he was dangerous. I thought he would challenge me, maybe even punish me. But instead, he showed me a better way. I've never felt so capable in my life." Alara nodded, impressed. She realized Jonah's influence was subtle, transformative, and peaceful, a rare kind of strength in the frontier, where violence often ruled the imagination. By evening, the suns began their descent and the land was bathed in shades of amber and rose. Alara and Jonah returned to the homestead, walking slowly and talking about her impressions of the day. "I think I understand now," Alara said. "You're not deadly to people. You're deadly to the systems that try to control them. You show them they can survive and thrive without fear, and that scares some people more than any weapon." Jonah smiled faintly. "Yes, that's exactly it, and it's why I've always preferred action over words. Teach, guide, and protect without harm, and people will learn far more than they ever could through force." Alara felt a deep admiration for him. He had crossed her expectations, showing her a kind of human potential she had only dreamed of. He was quiet but unyielding, patient but firm in his principles. The frontier had created him, but he had also mastered it, not through violence, but through wisdom, care, and perseverance. That night, as the twin moons rose over the plains, casting silver light across the land, Alara sat on the porch with Jonah. The stars above seemed brighter than anything on earth, endless and inviting. "Jonah," she said quietly, "do you ever worry that people will never understand you?" "Sometimes," he admitted. "But it doesn't matter. The truth will show itself to those willing to see it. And even if it doesn't, I live the way I believe is right. That's all anyone can do." Alara nodded. She felt inspired and hopeful, understanding that Jonah's life was more than just survival. It was a lesson in human potential, in the power of patience, cooperation, and self-reliance. As she watched the moons, she realized something profound. The frontier wasn't just a place of danger or isolation. It was a place where humans could discover what they were truly capable of. And Jonah Creed, the man the settlers whispered about in fear and admiration, was proof of that potential. Alara felt a renewed determination. She had crossed the stars expecting to meet a dangerous man. Instead, she had met someone who would teach her more about humanity than any lesson she had ever known. She was not afraid anymore. Instead, she was ready to learn, to grow, and to face the future with courage. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new lessons, and perhaps even new visitors. But tonight, under the endless stars of Caldera 9, Alara understood why Jonah Creed was called deadly. Not because he could harm anyone, but because he reminded humans of their own strength, intelligence, and capacity for greatness. And in that reminder, the frontier had found a new kind of hero, quiet, wise, and unstoppable in the most human way possible. The sun rose slowly over the plains of Caldera 9, its golden light stretching across the rolling hills and distant mountains. Alara awoke to the soft hum of the wind through the grasses, and for a moment she lay in bed, savoring the quiet. Life on this frontier world was unlike anything she had ever known, yet it had begun to feel like home. She dressed quickly, eager to start the day. Breakfast was already prepared, a simple meal of freshly baked bread, eggs, and fruits from the greenhouse. Jonah sat at the small table, reading a data tablet, his calm presence filling the room with ease. "Good morning," Alara said, pouring herself a cup of tea. "Good morning," Jonah replied, glancing up. "Sleep well?" "Yes," she said, smiling. "The stars last night were incredible. I could have stared at them forever." Jonah nodded. "Caldera 9 has a way of showing you things you might never notice elsewhere. The moons, the skies, even the wind, it teaches patience, observation, and care, just like life here." Alara took a sip of her tea, feeling the warmth spread through her. She had spent days learning from Jonah, observing the way he lived, how he taught settlers, and how he survived without causing harm. Every lesson deepened her respect for him. She understood now why people called him deadly, not because he was violent, but because his life challenged assumptions, inspired independence, and changed the world around him. After breakfast, Jonah led her outside. The homestead was bustling with activity. Several settlers had arrived over the past few days, eager to learn the techniques that had allowed Jonah to thrive. They were carefully tending the greenhouses, adjusting irrigation systems, and experimenting with planting patterns. "These settlers are learning quickly," Jonah said. "They see what works, what doesn't, and they adapt. That's what survival on this planet requires: intelligence and patience." Alara watched a young woman carefully reposition a row of seedlings. "They trust you," she said quietly. "Even the ones who arrived worried about you, they trust you now." Jonah smiled faintly. "Trust is earned, not demanded. People respect those who help them understand rather than those who force obedience. That's how I survive out here and how I thrive." As they walked toward the edge of the homestead, Alara's curiosity grew. She had understood Jonah's reputation and his methods, but there was one question that lingered in her mind. Why had he chosen her? Why had he agreed to a marriage arranged across the stars with someone he had never met? "Jonah," she began hesitantly, "can I ask, why me? Why did you agree to a mail-order marriage?" Jonah stopped walking and looked out over the plains. His expression was thoughtful, and he seemed to weigh his words carefully before speaking. "I didn't choose a bride lightly," he said slowly. "Life on the frontier is hard, and survival isn't just about food, water, or shelter. It's about connection, understanding, and trust. I needed someone who could share this life, not just endure it but participate in it, understand it, and help grow it. That's why I chose you." Alara blinked, surprised. "Me? Why?" "Because," Jonah said, "you asked questions even before you arrived. You didn't come here blindly, thinking only of romance or comfort. You came here because you were curious, willing to learn, and brave enough to face the unknown. Those qualities are rare. On this planet, they're essential." Alara felt her heart swell. She had always wondered if her decision to leave Earth had been foolish, if she had been naive to trust in a stranger across the stars. But Jonah's words reassured her. She had been chosen not for appearance, wealth, or status, but for her character and willingness to grow. They spent the morning exploring the homestead together, checking the irrigation systems and observing the settlers. Jonah continued to teach, explaining the reasoning behind each decision, showing Alara how to read the land, the soil, and the plants. "You see," Jonah said, pointing to a patch of soil that had been carefully tilled, "life here isn't just about planting and harvesting. It's about understanding patterns, anticipating needs, and making choices that respect the land." Humans can survive harsh conditions if they observe and adapt. That's what makes us special. Alara nodded, absorbing the lesson. She realized that Jonah's teachings were more than practical, they were philosophical. He wasn't just showing people how to live on Caldera 9. He was teaching them how to think, how to adapt, and how to thrive without harming others. By afternoon, Jonah decided it was time to introduce Alara to the heart of his work, the settlers who had fully embraced his philosophy. They gathered in a small clearing near the homestead, each person eager to share their progress and insights. One by one, the settlers spoke about how Jonah's guidance had changed their lives. A young man who had struggled to grow crops in the harsh soil described how careful observation and patience had allowed him to cultivate a thriving garden. A woman who had once relied heavily on automated systems explained how learning to work with the land had given her confidence and independence. Alara listened in awe. Each story reinforced what she had already begun to understand. Jonah's power was not in dominance or fear, but in his ability to inspire and teach. He had created a ripple effect that transformed lives, and that transformation was why he was called deadly by some. It threatened old ways of thinking and forced people to confront their assumptions about strength, power, and survival. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, Jonah led Alara to a small hill overlooking the settlement. The view was breathtaking. The plains stretched endlessly, dotted with greenhouses, irrigation channels, and small homes that blended harmoniously with the landscape. The settlers moved about their tasks with confidence and purpose, evidence of Jonah's influence and guidance. "You see," Jonah said, "this is why I chose a partner. Life here isn't something you endure alone, it's something you share. Someone who understands, who participates, and who helps strengthen the community makes all the difference. That's why I wanted you here, not just for me, but for the life we can build together." Alara felt a deep sense of belonging. She had traveled across the stars expecting fear and danger, but what she had found was understanding, purpose, and connection. Jonah had not chosen her lightly. He had chosen her because she could grow alongside him, contribute to the settlement, and embrace the frontier in the same way he did. As the evening fell, the settlers gathered around a communal fire. They shared stories, laughter, and the small joys of life on the frontier. Jonah and Alara sat together, observing quietly, allowing the settlers to take center stage. Alara leaned closer to Jonah. "It's incredible," she whispered. "You've built more than a homestead. You've built a community, a way of life." Jonah smiled. "And it's growing. Every person who learns, adapts, and shares their knowledge strengthens the whole. That's what survival really means, not just for one person but for everyone." Alara watched the firelight dance across the faces of the settlers. She realized that this was what she had been searching for, a purpose beyond herself, a life that mattered not just to her, but to the people and the land around her. That night under the twin moons of Caldera 9, Jonah and Alara sat side by side on the porch, looking out over the plains. The stars above were bright and endless, and the quiet hum of the night filled the air. "You've taught me so much already," Alara said softly. "I came here expecting danger, but I've found life, purpose, and understanding. I think I finally understand why you're considered deadly. Not because you hurt people, but because you challenge them to grow, to think, and to be better." Jonah nodded, his expression calm and thoughtful. "Yes, and that's the kind of danger I want to be known for. The danger that awakens potential, inspires action, and encourages growth. That's the true frontier. It's not the land, the storms, or the creatures. It's the human spirit. And you, Alara, are part of it now." Alara felt a warmth spread through her chest. She had traveled across the galaxy, guided by rumors and warnings, and what she had found was a man whose quiet strength inspired humans to reach their fullest potential. Jonah Creed was deadly, not in the way anyone had feared, but in the way that mattered most. He awakened what was best in people. And as they watched the moons rise over the plains, Alara knew that the life ahead would be challenging, rewarding, and full of discovery. Together, they would build a future where humans could thrive, not through fear or dominance, but through understanding, cooperation, and the quiet power of being truly human. The sun rose slowly over Caldera 9, casting long shadows across the plains. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of earth, herbs, and the small blooms that dotted the homestead. Today was not an ordinary day. Word had spread quickly through the settlements that Jonah Creed, the man they whispered about as deadly, would be speaking publicly to a group of officials and settlers visiting from nearby colonies. Alara walked beside Jonah as he prepared. There was no tension in his movements, only calm precision. He checked the water systems, ensured the plants were thriving, and made small adjustments to the irrigation channels. Each action was deliberate, quiet, and purposeful, an expression of the life he had built here, a life that had already begun to reshape the frontier in ways that were subtle yet undeniable. "You seem calm," Alara said, watching him adjust a solar panel. Jonah looked at her and smiled faintly. "Calm is necessary. Fear, anger, or pretense never teach anything. Today is about showing the truth, not performing for their expectations." Alara nodded, understanding. She had witnessed Jonah's influence firsthand over the past days. The settlers he had guided had become more confident, more capable, and more independent. Jonah's reputation as deadly had grown not because of violence, but because he inspired change, change that threatened old assumptions and challenged control. By mid-morning, the visitors arrived. The group included colonial officials, settlers from neighboring homesteads, and curious travelers. They approached cautiously, exchanging quiet words and glances. Many had heard the rumors, and some arrived with skepticism or fear. Jonah greeted them warmly, offering smiles, handshakes, and introductions. Alara watched as the tension in the group slowly shifted. Jonah's presence was calming, yet it carried an undeniable authority, not of fear, but of competence and wisdom. Once everyone had settled near the homestead, Jonah stood on a small rise, using the natural elevation to address the crowd. Alara stood beside him, feeling the anticipation in the air. "Thank you all for coming," Jonah began. His voice was calm, steady, and carried clearly across the plains. "I know you have heard stories about me, that I am dangerous, deadly, unpredictable. You may have been warned. You may have expected a man who would fight, command, or intimidate. And perhaps, in a way, you were right to expect someone unusual, but the truth is different from the stories you have heard." He paused, letting the words sink in. The visitors looked at him with a mixture of curiosity and caution. "The danger people speak of," Jonah continued, "is not in my hands, my strength, or my actions against others. The danger lies in what I represent. I show humans that they can survive, thrive, and grow without relying on fear, control, or domination. I teach independence, patience, and cooperation. I remind people of what they are capable of when they work together, respect the land, and think for themselves." Alara felt a stir in the crowd. Some settlers whispered to each other, nodding. Others looked puzzled, unsure of what he meant. The officials shifted in their seats, exchanging quiet glances. Jonah continued, his gaze sweeping across the plains. "Many fear change. They fear humans who succeed without harming others. They fear knowledge, self-reliance, and courage, the kind of courage that makes people free to think and act on their own. That is why they call me deadly. I do not fight or harm. I simply remind humans of their potential." A murmur ran through the crowd. Some settlers began to smile, recognizing the truth in his words. The officials, however, seemed unsure how to respond. They had come expecting confrontation or defiance, yet here was a man whose life and philosophy were gentle, yet transformative. Alara watched Jonah closely. She understood now why people called him deadly. It was not about destruction or violence, It was about empowerment. Jonah challenged old systems, old assumptions, and old fears. He demonstrated that humans could thrive without domination, and that example was more powerful than any weapon. One of the officials, a tall woman with a clipboard, stepped forward. "Mr. Creed," she said, her voice cautious but polite, "many in the colonies consider your methods unconventional. Can you explain why you choose to live and teach this way, instead of following the standard protocols of settlement management?" Jonah nodded. "Yes. I choose this way because it works. I have learned that survival is not just about rules, reports, or orders. Survival is about understanding the environment, respecting the land, and empowering the people who live on it. Systems that depend on fear, control, or coercion fail eventually. Humans who adapt, learn, and cooperate endure. That is the frontier principle I follow." Alara noticed that the settlers around them were listening intently, some nodding in agreement. The woman with the clipboard raised an eyebrow. "So you're saying your influence is not through force but through example?" Jonah smiled faintly. "Exactly. I do not impose, I guide. I do not command, I teach. And I do not harm, because strength is not measured by what you can destroy, but by what you can inspire." There was a pause. The officials whispered among themselves. The settlers, however, began to understand. They had witnessed Jonah's methods firsthand, and his words now gave them meaning. The man they had feared for his reputation as deadly was, in fact, the most human and capable of them all. One of the settlers, a young man who had recently built his first thriving greenhouse, stepped forward. "Mr. Creed," he said, "you've taught me how to manage my land, how to grow crops, and how to trust myself. You didn't command me or scare me. You showed me." "That's incredible," Jonah nodded. "Thank you. That is the point. Humans are capable of far more than we often allow ourselves to believe. The frontier is not only land to survive on, it is a place to discover what we can truly achieve." Alara felt a warmth in her chest. This was why she had come. She had wanted to meet Jonah, to understand the man behind the rumors, and now she saw the full truth. Jonah was deadly not because of violence, but because he reminded people of their potential. That reminder could reshape entire colonies, entire civilizations, if people were willing to embrace it. The official with the clipboard finally spoke again. "Mr. Creed, I admit, I didn't expect this. You are extraordinary. Your methods, your philosophy, your influence, they are different, perhaps revolutionary." Jonah nodded. "Revolutionary, yes, but not in the way most imagine. There are no battles, no weapons, no forced changes. The revolution comes from within each person who learns to survive, adapt, and grow. The frontier does not need fear, it needs humans willing to be their best selves." A hush fell over the crowd. The settlers nodded, inspired and proud. The officials seemed to absorb the message, though some looked uncertain. But the seed of understanding had been planted. Alara stepped closer to Jonah, her hand brushing his. "You were right," she whispered. This is exactly the answer they needed. Not force, not threats. Just truth." Jonah smiled softly. "Sometimes the most powerful answer is the simplest one. Remind people of who they are and they become unstoppable." The day continued with conversations, demonstrations, and shared meals. The settlers asked questions, eager to learn more about the land, the irrigation systems, and the philosophy that guided Jonah's life. The officials observed quietly, their skepticism gradually giving way to curiosity and respect. As evening fell, the twin moons rose over Caldera 9, casting silver light across the plains. Jonah and Alara stood together, looking out at the thriving homestead and the settlers who had begun to embrace this new way of life. "You've changed everything," Alara said softly. "Not with weapons, not with fear, but with everything else. Patience, care, guidance. You've reminded them what humans can do." Jonah nodded. "And that is the true frontier. The land is harsh, yes, but the human spirit is stronger." That is what people fear when they call me deadly. Not me, but the strength that lives in each of us, waiting to be awakened. Alara felt a deep sense of pride. She had traveled across the stars expecting danger, and had found something far more remarkable, a man who could inspire humanity to its fullest potential. The settlers gathered around the fire that night, sharing laughter, stories, and hopes for the future. Jonah and Alara sat quietly, observing the community they were helping to build. Every face reflected possibility, growth, and human resilience. And in that quiet, under the endless stars of Caldera 9, Alara understood the truth fully. Jonah Creed was deadly, not in the way anyone had feared, but in the way that mattered most. He awakened potential. He inspired growth. He reminded humans that their greatest strength was not in weapons, domination, or fear, but in patience, cooperation, and the courage to be their best selves. Alara leaned against Jonah, feeling safe, inspired, and ready for the future. She had crossed the galaxy expecting a dangerous man. Instead, she had found someone who could teach humanity its most powerful lesson, that the true frontier was not the land, but the human spirit, and that the most extraordinary humans were those who could awaken it in others. And as the twin moons shone over the plains, casting their silver light across Caldera 9, Alara knew that the frontier would never be the same. Humanity had found a new kind of hero, quiet, wise, and unstoppable in the most human way possible. The legend of the deadly cowboy, whispered across settlements and colonies, would live on, not as a tale of fear, but as a story of hope, strength, and human potential realized.